So it seems we live in a time that's likely to be remembered as a time that's particularly notorious for bad faith arguments, hyperbolic and baseless claims, and in general, just faulty logic in our public discussion. But dishonesty and tricks in rhetoric and persuasion is a tradition that is as old as time. In fact, at the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, when they were doing their work, much of their writing on rhetoric and persuasion was motivated by the bad arguments that they were hearing at the time, coming primarily from a group of people who were called the sophists. And if you're familiar with this, the sophists are really the world's first speech teachers. They were private tutors. In Athens, you couldn't hire a lawyer to represent you in court. You had to represent yourself. So if you were a wealthy person who needed to make an argument in public, you could hire one of these sophists, and they would teach you the tricks of the trade. And the sophists were kind of notorious at their time for bragging about their abilities to defeat true and virtuous arguments with bad faith arguments. And they thought, winner takes all. That's all that really matters. And, getting paid by their students. So the sophists kind of have a bad reputation, and they are remembered as kind of the motivation for Aristotle's study of rhetoric and his development of logical systems for speakers to analyze and evaluate arguments for their truthfulness. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about argumentation, and in particular, we're going to talk about a thing called Toulmin's model. And this is in the Aristotelian Western tradition. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. Here we see Toulmin's model is made up of these main three things: evidence, claim, and warrant. Another part of Toulmin's model that's not talked about in the textbook are qualifiers and rebuttals. So we're going to start today by talking about this model, and then once we finish talking about that, we'll turn to looking at some fallacies of logic, some arguments that look like they might be good, but when we examine them further with Toulmin's model, we see that they're faulty in some way. So before I begin, I just want to say that Toulmin's model is not an arrangement strategy. So this is not a way you should organize your speeches. We're still organizing our speeches as discussed in the speech 3 prompt, using some variation of problem solution. An upcoming lecture is going to talk about organization. So this is not about organization. Rather, this is a way for us to analyze and assess the quality of our arguments. And so the three basic parts that you see here, evidence, claim, and warrant, are really the three main parts of an argument as discussed in our readings. Really quickly, let me give you a basic argument. Let's just imagine for a second that you're on your way to some important appointment and you get pulled over, right? So you're about to get an argument coming at you from an officer who's going to make certain claims here, right? So the first thing the officer might do is provide you with some evidence and say, hey, I clocked you going 100 miles an hour. Well, you're in trouble, aren't you? But you're convinced that maybe you're still able to wiggle your way out of this despite this evidence, and you say, so what, right? So you just pulled me over to tell me how fast I was going. Why are you giving me this fact, this evidence? Okay, so basically you're asking, what's the claim here? What is the officer claiming when they're presenting you with this evidence? Now, you or I know where the claim is going here, right? The claim is going to be you were speeding. So based on the evidence, I clocked you going 100 miles an hour. Now the officer's claiming you were speeding. Okay, and for most of us, that's really all we need to hear, right? I'm pretty persuaded. I'm going to get a ticket here, but not you, not today. You're not satisfied yet with this evidence in this claim, and so you say to the officer, uh, "So how does that evidence what does that evidence of me going 100 miles an hour have to do with speeding, buddy?" Okay, and so really what you're asking here from the officer is for the warrant of the argument, but you're treading on thin ice. You might end up with another kind of warrant here if you're not capable or if you're not careful. But the warrant offers then an explanation for how the evidence led the officer to make a conclusion that you were speeding. Right, so the evidence is you were going 100 miles an hour. Based on that, how did the officer come to the conclusion that you were speeding? What's the warrant? And of course, the warrant would be the speed limit, right? You'd have to know that there's a speed limit and how speed limits work, and you have to know that there are laws that penalize people for going over the speed limit, right? So if you ask for that, you would say, so I was going 100 miles an hour. You say I'm speeding. Explain to me how that's true, right? Well, you were going over the speed limit. So there's a basic argument right there using Toulmin's model. I'm going to jump into each of these things a little more specifically and explain them. And let's just go ahead and do that, beginning with evidence. Okay. So evidence is where, the argument really should begin, right? You need to start by doing your research, right? Examining the facts and the evidence that you see before coming to any conclusions. So really an argument should start by examining all available evidence. What is evidence? Well, it's any credible information, right? Any information that you can hold up and say, this is true information, right? And the more true it is, the more it's accepted as true by your audience, the better the evidence is. So good evidence is evidence that's not going to really be up for debate when you present it. If you present your evidence and the audience starts questioning that evidence, now we're shifting the argument down some and now we're arguing over our evidence. So we want our evidence to be something that's not something we can really argue much over. So what are types of evidence? You could read more about these, of course, in the textbook. Examples, facts, especially established facts, known facts, narratives, stories, stories from experts, stories from history, statistics, or any type of findings or results that come from scientific research are great evidence. And then testimony, right? Testimony from eyewitnesses, people who were there, who could testify to what actually happened, as well as expert testimony, expert opinions. So you want to use a good combination of different types of evidence in your speech, and you're going to have to remember that the audience, to some extent, determines the value of the evidence, right? So if they respect the kind of evidence that you are providing them with, that makes it better evidence to use when talking to them, right? And so the evidence can depend somewhat on who you're going to be talking to. Okay, so that's evidence, and remember, yes, the argument starts with the evidence, and the evidence then should motivate the claim, right? So the evidence is what leads us to a claim that we're going to make, and the claim is the thing that we want to persuade the audience to accept. It's a statement that's up for debate. Not everybody agrees on it, and so that's why we're making the claim. We want to get people to agree with us. We've talked about this at this point pretty extensively, I believe. So I'm just going to quickly go over these. A fact claim says whether something is true or not true. A value claim tells you whether something is good or bad. A policy claim, which is what we're doing for speech number 3, tells you what should be done by somebody or something. And then one that's not talked about in the textbook but is mentioned sometimes is a definitional claim. That's a claim where you say, this thing is defined in this way, right? Or something like this band should be thought of as a rock band or a jazz band, right? So it's making a claim about how something should be defined. All right, so the important thing to remember here, though, is that the claims should be based on data. Don't go making claims without evidence. Let's say you just want to claim you won an election because of mass voter fraud. You ought to be able to give some evidence before you go making those claims. That's usually the correct order of the moral universe. So those are claims, and that brings me to a part of Toulmin's model that's not discussed in the textbook that relates to claims, which are qualifiers and rebuttals. Let me just take a moment to just go over these. The qualifiers and rebuttals, essentially, they just adjust the scope of the claim. They tell the audience to what extent is this claim true, right? So it's going to adjust the scope and the strength. A qualifier might be, I may go on a date with you, right? Or I will go on a date with you, right? Those are significantly different strengths, right? So you're saying, I got a chance, right? And then the rebuttal would be to address any of the exceptions. I may go on a date with you if I don't have to work this weekend, right? So it adjusts the claim by making an exception to it. Okay, so this is important because sometimes we have a tendency to be hyperbolic with our claims or to make unqualified claims when we really should qualify our claims. So sometimes we can adjust the strength and the scope to be a little more accurate and to acknowledge the situations in which our claims wouldn't hold up, which will strengthen our argument ultimately. Moving from there, back to Toulmin's here. So the kind of two main parts so far we've talked about are the evidence, which leads us to the claim. The warrant is going to explain then how the evidence led us to that claim. It is going to offer a connection between the claim and the evidence that supports it. And if that connection is logical, the argument is likely to be persuasive. If the connection is illogical or faulty, then that argument is likely going to fall short in certain ways. So the warrant is really what the argument hinges upon. And we're going to dig deep into warrants and go further into it than the textbook does. And hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more about logic. So a warrant then is the logical explanation of how the data supports the claim. Sometimes this is implicit. You have a 101 degree fever. You have a 101 degree temperature. Therefore, you have a fever. I don't really need to have that explained to me why that is the case, right? If you just tell me that, I will accept it. The warrant then in that case is implicit. But for our work, we really want to make sure that our audiences can see the connection between the data and the claim. So we often want to make the warrant more explicit or clear to our audiences. So let's look at kind of different types of warrants. These are also talked about as types of arguments themselves, so ways of making arguments. But this is the way in which data can relate to a claim. So the first way is through what's called deductive reasoning or deduction. And when we think of deduction, I like to think of it as what I call top-down reasoning. Reasoning from really big general facts to a conclusion about something very specific. So for deductive reasoning, the formula generally is we have a major premise, an accepted fact, plus a minor premise, another accepted fact. We add those two together, and then we come to a conclusion. So here's a classic example. Here's a big fact, a major premise. People are mortal, right? Everyone dies, essentially. And then to that, we're going to add a second fact. Our guy here, Sherlock Holmes, seems to be a person. So if we add those together, people are mortal, Sherlock is a person. What's the conclusion? Oh, sorry to break it to you, Sherlock, but you're going to die, right? Sherlock is immortal would be the conclusion. So we take two known facts and we reason our way to a specific third fact. For this to work, for this type of reasoning to work, in other words, for this argument above to be warranted, those two premises have to be true, right? So if one of those is not true, the conclusion will not be true. Further, the conclusion, the third fact that we reason our way to, actually has to follow from the two premises, right? So if we did, people are mortal, Sherlock is a person, therefore Sherlock is going to play golf, that's ridiculous, right? It does not follow. So as long as those two conditions exist, the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premises, this is a pretty persuasive warrant. All right, so that's deductive reasoning, and that is a basis for a lot of our thought. The reverse of that is called inductive reasoning, and is what we generally associate with scientific reasoning. And I like to think of this as bottom-up reasoning because we are reasoning from really specific observations on the ground, many of them, to a general observation, an abstract observation about the whole. Okay, so you're going from specific observations to come to a conclusion about the whole. 3 out of 4 employees are happy according to our survey, right? Okay, so this is an inductive reasoning. I went and I observed particular employees. I asked them, are you happy or not? And I've come to the conclusion, based on my inductive reasoning, that 75% of the whole about are happy. So is this a good argument? Is this argument warranted based on the evidence that we have? Well, it is if we can ascertain that these 3 conditions exist. One, is it a recent sample? Did we take the survey recently, or is it a very old sample? If it's an old sample, then it might be out of date. Things could have changed. So that would be a fault in that logic if it's an old sample. So it's got to be recent. It's got to be large enough sample. Okay, so statisticians say that the minimum size for a sample should be about 100. So if your group whole is less than 100, you should ask all of them, right? So if there's less than 100 employees, you'd want to ask all the employees you could before coming to a conclusion. The maximum sample size should be 10% of your whole group, all the way up to a sample size of I believe, 1,000. And once you've asked 1,000 people, any kind of, no matter how big the population is above that, 1,000-person sample should give you a pretty good representation. So you need to ask somewhere between 100 and 1,000 people, depending on how big the total population is. You don't have to actually do the surveys, though, so just make sure you're using good data from good researchers, and they're going to make sure that it's a large enough sample. And then it also needs to be a typical sample. It can't be a sample of outliers. It can't be a sample that's not representative of the whole. So if you're asking your employees if they're happy, and you ask only for example only the managers, That's not a good sample. The managers are only a small portion of the whole. Or if you asked all the men, right, you might miss something because you're not getting a sample that's representative. So as long as those three conditions are met, then an inductive reasoning is a pretty warranted argument. Here's another one, causation, argument from cause. And when we're making an argument from cause, we're saying that if X happens, then Y will follow. In other words, X causes Y. Cell phone use increased traffic accidents. So cell phone use caused traffic accidents to go up. So causation is a real tricky thing to ascertain, to establish. So it's a difficult argument to make. That doesn't mean we can't make it. It just means that we need to really check to see that our argument is warranted. So for this to be true, X has to come before Y. Cell phone use has to increase before traffic accidents increase. If we can show that traffic accidents started to increase before cell phone use did, then it makes no sense that cell phone use would be the cause of the increase, right? So it has to be in the proper order. The cause has to come before the effect, right? Also, it has to be a reasonable explanation, right? It has to be reasonable to think that it's possible for cell phones to cause an accident, right? And I think for most of us that is, right? Anybody who's talked on a phone or texted on a phone while driving is probably pretty personally aware that cell phones can cause distracted driving, which can lead to accidents, right? So that seems reasonable to me. And then there has to be no better explanation that's readily available. This needs to be the best explanation, right? So let's say they introduced drive-through drive-through windows and people started eating in their cars more. Maybe it's the people eating while they're driving that's causing the increase in traffic accidents. So that's a possibility we would want to explore, and ultimately we want to go with what is the most reasonable explanation, the best explanation for the cause that we have available. We might never really be able to prove that it's not just a matter of correlation between these things, that one is actually causing the other. That's actually pretty difficult to prove. But as long as we can assert that these three conditions exist, X came before Y, it's reasonable to think that X is possibly causing Y, and this is the best explanation we have, you have a pretty good argument from cause. That argument's likely warranted. An argument from sign, our fourth one we're going to discuss here, is pretty easy actually. If X is present, then Y is present, right? If we see that X is here, we have that data, then we can assume, because we know X is a reliable sign of Y, that Y must also be present. So when we check to see whether or not you have a fever, we're not looking for an infection typically. We're actually looking for your temperature, right? We're going to measure your temperature. You have a temperature of 102 degrees. So from that, I'm going to make the conclusion, the claim that you have a fever. So the warrant then would be an explanation of how temperature is a reliable sign of fever, right? And you'd have to know that when your body has an infection, it releases these pathogens that go to your brain, and they affect the part of your brain that controls your temperature, right? And so your temperature tends to go up when you have an infection, and it's part of your body's attempt to fight that infection off. So the temperature is a sign of the fever, and a pretty dang reliable sign of the fever. So if you want to argue that the stock market is going to crash because men's underwear sales are plummeting, right? You'd have to argue that plummeting men's underwear sales are actually a sign of economic strength or economic weakness, right? And actually some economists do look for men's underwear sales as a sign of the health of the economy. But it would be up to them to make that argument for why that's a reliable sign. And lastly is argument from example, an argument that's warranted because it's saying that this thing is analogous to this other thing. So arguing from example is sometimes called arguing from analogy, reasoning by comparison. It worked for them, so it'll work for us, right? So that's a pretty, sound argument in some ways. They did it, it worked. So if we do it, it will also work. Is that a warranted argument? It is if the two things we are comparing are similar in all important aspects, right? So Colorado was able to raise a bunch of taxes, raise a bunch of revenues by legalizing marijuana. If we do the same, we will also, raise our revenues. Okay, great. That's true as long as the way we do it and the similarities between our states are the same in all important aspects, right? So the way you would argue against an argument from analogy would be to say that this is a false analogy, that you're comparing two things that should not be compared. And so one where the things being compared are similar is a warranted argument. Okay, so that's our deep look at warrants. And the important part here is that the warrant explains how did this data lead me to the conclusion. And if your audience can't see the warrant, your persuasion is going to fail. So you need to help the audience see the significance of your data and how that data leads you to make your claim. That's the work of persuasion here. So that's a quick look at Toulmin's model. Now let's take a look at some of the fallacies of logic. I want to go over these pretty quickly. I'll just talk over them and give an example of each. This is talked about again in the textbook in, I believe, chapter 13. Fallacies of logic are things that look like they're good arguments at first, but when you examine them further, you realize that they're illogical, that there's something wrong with them. So fallacies are kind of fun. You can use them to call out your friends, and make them feel stupid. So here you go. False cause is a bad argument from cause, right? The rooster crows every time right before the sun rises. Therefore, the rooster must be causing the sun to rise, right? That's not true. Roosters can't cause the sun to rise. So just because it comes before it every time doesn't mean it causes it. You're making a false cause. Hasty generalization is where you take one observation of one specific thing and you use that to make a generalization, right? You're essentially not getting enough data. So this is the classic, I heard one thing from a friend, this anecdote, and from that, I'm making this big conclusion. My friend said it was really crazy down at the Strip the other night, so nobody should go down there, right? Well, you might want some more information before you make such a hasty generalization. A slippery slope is kind of fun. This is where it's an argument from cause where you are really moving far down the causal chain from the original action, right? So there was a slippery slope argument made against gay marriage, right? If gay marriage is legalized, it will damage the family, the moral standing of our country will fall, and crime will be everywhere, and basically the country's going to fall apart because we let gay people have the same marriage rights as everybody else. Okay, so that's a slippery slope. At best, you want to stick to the most immediate effects. So if this happens, then what will be the effect, the most immediate effect. Once you start going really far down to this kind of snowball rolling down a hill, this slippery slope, that's when you're entering into really fallacious territory. It's hard enough to say that X causes Y, let alone to say that X causes Y, which will cause Z, which will cause, the pits of hell to open up. Okay. Straw person is kind of fun. That's where you misrepresent your opponents and you say that their argument is some absurd version that's really easy to defeat, right? And so you think of a scarecrow, you pretend that your opponent is a scarecrow, and then you beat up the scarecrow. Really, how impressive there, right? So we see this perhaps in the abortion debate, where someone who is anti-abortion might say, my opponents are for abortion on demand no matter what, right? Well, somebody might be arguing that, but generally speaking, that is not the argument that's being made by your opponent. So when you misrepresent that, it's easy to attack a misrepresented version of your opponent than to really address the arguments that your opponent is making. So that's a straw person. Appeals to tradition are pretty easy. We've done it this way before, so we should continue doing it this way. You need more reasons than just we've done it before. As we've seen, traditions have been wrong many, many times and often are until they change. Ad hominem is where you just attack the person making the argument rather than their argument. So it's name calling. You say we need to raise a tax. I say you're a bad father. Okay, well, I don't know how that has anything to do with what you're saying, but it could work. I could distract and get people just mad at you for being a bad dad, even though your argument is pretty sound. So ad hominem is really just not addressing the argument and attacking the person. Well, I hope this was a helpful look at argumentation and logic, and it will, I think, help you not only with your speech, but with the quizzes. Remember that the integrity of our democracy, in many ways, depends upon our ability to not only make good arguments, but to be able to find them and know that they're good, and to ignore and don't pay attention to the bad ones. So Toulmin's model will help us do that. Have a great day.